Hey everyone, for my artist project, I chose to research AC/DC. So here's a documentary of one of the best rock bands of all time. The Young family originally lived in Glasgow, Scotland, when main band members Angus and Malcolm were children, but they eventually immigrated to Sydney, Australia. Angus and Malcolm were inspired by their older brother George, who was in an Australian band called Easy Beats, and Easy Beats had a few Australian hits. The two brothers then formed AC/DC in 1973. At the time, Angus was only 15 years old and Malcolm was 20. So here are the two founding members, Angus on lead guitar and Malcolm on rhythm guitar. And here are the other three original members of AC/DC. Dave Evans on vocals, Mark Evans on bass, and Phil Rudd on drums. AC/DC went through many lineup changes throughout its history. The first is the replacement of vocalist Dave Evans, who left in 1974, only a year after the band's creation. The band brought in Bon Scott to replace him. Scott had served time in jail and was a gritty character, which played in nicely with the band's hard rock style. After the death of Bon Scott in 1980, he was quickly replaced by Brian Johnson, who first featured on the band's 1980 album Back in Black. Drummer Phil Rudd left the band in 1983, and he was replaced by Simon Wright. Wright then left the band in 1988, and he was replaced by Chris Slade. In the early years of the band, Angus and Malcolm recruited their brother George to produce their first few records. After making a few demos, the band was quickly signed to Albert Records. The band pumped out its first two albums, High Voltage, in 1974, and TNT in 1975. Both records went platinum in Australia. AC/DC's music is heavily influenced by both rock and roll and rhythm and blues. The band quickly became known for their crazy and outrageous concerts. During guitar solos, Angus would play his guitar while spinning himself on the floor, a routine that came to be known as guitar spasms. He also incorporated his own version of Chuck Berry's Duck Walk and would wear a school outfit, which became his iconic onstage look. Most of the band's music was written by founding members Angus and Malcolm Young. They mostly wrote their gritty hard rock songs, which is what AC/DC is famous for, but they had their detours from that style. The band's song Ride On features Malcolm's smooth rhythm guitar playing under Angus's excellent solos, with Phil Rudd giving a nice and easy blues rhythm on the drums. In 1975, the band decided to relocate to London. There, they signed an international record deal with Atlantic Records. In the years leading up to 1979, the band toured both the UK and the United States. The band's first worldwide hit was Highway to Hell, a song off their album of the same name. The album was the band's first record to sell over 1 million copies worldwide. Unfortunately, the glory and success that came with Highway to Hell was cut short. On February 19th, 1980, lead singer Bon Scott was found dead in a friend's car. Scott and his friend had gone out for a day of drinking when Scott went out to the car to sober up. The official report said that Scott had drank himself to death. After Scott's death, the band brought in Brian Johnson to replace him. AC/DC then teamed up with producer Mutt Lange and released their album Back in Black in 1980. This album went on to become their best and most successful album they ever made. The album contains instantly recognizable songs like Back in Black, You Shook Me All Night Long, Shoot to Thrill, and Hell's Bells. The album sold over 50 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling albums of all time. So at this point, you guys can pause the video and follow the link in the description to watch AC/DC perform Back in Black at Donington. Now on to some social, political, and cultural changes of the 1970s. Protests against the Vietnam War raged throughout the United States from the late 60s to the early 70s. The protests got increasingly dangerous over the years, with the worst being Kent State. In May 1970, 4 students from Kent State University who were protesting the war in Vietnam were shot by Army National Guard. The protests continued until 1973, when President Richard Nixon ended U.S. involvement in South Asia. A major political issue of the 1970s was the Iranian hostage crisis, which took place in 1979. After World War II, the CIA had staged a coup in Iran that placed a leader in power that was open to Western influence and was opposed to communism. However, he turned out to be a brutal dictator who was eventually kicked out of the country and forced to flee to Egypt. Islamic militants raided the U.S. Embassy and took 66 hostages. Women and African Americans were immediately released because the militants believed they were already under the oppression of American society. The rest of the hostages were kept there for another 444 days until Ronald Reagan was elected president, and then they were released. Cultural changes in the 1970s influenced how families spent their free time. Advancing technology was a main factor in this change. Disco music was wildly popular in the 1970s and is one of the defining aspects of culture in the 70s. Disco music also influenced both film and fashion. The 70s was also a time where the women's rights movement gained popularity from many women of many different backgrounds and political views. The movement pushed for the Equal Rights Amendment, but it was never passed because there was an anti-women's rights movement led by Phyllis Schlafly, who claimed that the amendment would hurt women who enjoyed life as a housewife. It was almost ratified. It had the approval of both houses of Congress. 42 states, and even Richard Nixon approved. But since they never got the correct number of states to approve it, it was never passed. The gay rights movement also gained a lot of ground in the 70s. Gay Pride Week was established, and the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from the list of psychiatric disorders in 1973. AC/DC did not do any political songwriting during their time. Their music was strictly for entertainment purposes. Their music is meant to be playable at parties and is a great arena/concert type of music. AC/DC did write about their own struggles and their own experiences. For example, the band's album Back in Black was a tribute to Bon Scott, who had passed away that same year in 1980. And Highway to Hell was a reference to Bon Scott's favorite pub in Australia. They did write one song that was kind of political, but not really. It was called Big Balls, and I mean, obviously the song is mostly a joke, but it does poke fun at the rich and high society and their high money spending. Technology was changing in the recording studio during the 70s and throughout AC/DC's whole career, really. AC/DC employed the 24-track recording machine in the 70s, and that allowed them to record many performances at different times. Digital delay and many types of guitar pedals also emerged during this time, and the modern Stratocaster was also created in the 70s, and the design still holds today. AC/DC were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2003. In their 46-year history, they have sold over 200 million records worldwide and have gone on 21 world tours. If I were to describe AC/DC with a few words, they would be consistent in the fact that they have had so many hits over the years, and they're wildly popular. You know, they're instantly recognizable for most people. They're resilient. After the death of Bon Scott, you know, some bands would deteriorate after something so tragic like that. Even an example of Nirvana, after the death of Kurt Cobain, basically the band disbanded, and yeah, they didn't put out any more records. But AC/DC recovered and even made their best record right after he had passed away, which is extremely hard to do. And I'd also say that they're extremely talented performers. You saw in the video that you can see how much passion they have for what they do, and that they're also just extremely talented and know how to put on a good show, which is always part of being a music artist. You have to know how to put on a show, otherwise, you know, no one's going to come watch you. And here are my works cited, and thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed.